David Thompson pulled his black Tesla into the parking lot of Rosie's Diner, the same spot he'd been parking in every Saturday morning for the past 2 years. It was 9:15 a.m. sharp, not because he planned it that way, but because his 6-year-old son Tommy needed everything to happen at exactly the right time, in exactly the right way. "Ready, buddy?" David asked, turning around to look at his son in the back seat. Tommy was already unbuckling his seatbelt, his small hands moving with the precision of someone who had done this exact same thing dozens of times before. He clutched his red backpack tight against his chest. Inside were his crayons arranged in a specific order that only Tommy understood, and his drawing pad that never left his side. Tommy didn't answer. He never did, not with words anyway. But David had learned to read his son's language over the years. The way Tommy's shoulders relaxed when he saw the familiar diner sign, the little bounce in his step as they walked toward the door. These small signs told David everything he needed to know. The bell above the door chimed as they entered, and David felt that familiar knot in his stomach. He loved these Saturday mornings with Tommy, but he also dreaded them. Not because of Tommy, never because of Tommy, but because of everyone else. The businessman in the corner booth looked up from his newspaper and stared. An elderly couple near the window whispered to each other. A mother with 2 young children pulled her kids a little closer as Tommy walked by, making his soft humming sounds and flapping his hands in the way that helped him feel calm. David had gotten used to the stares over the years. Well, maybe not used to them, but he'd learned to ignore them. Most of the time, he was worth $53 million, had built a tech company from nothing and could buy this entire diner without thinking twice about it. But none of that mattered when people looked at his son like he was some kind of puzzle they couldn't solve. Tommy headed straight for their usual booth in the back corner, the one with the red vinyl seats that squeaked when you moved. He always sat on the same side, facing the kitchen, because he liked watching the cooks flip pancakes. David slid in across from him, watching as his son immediately began his ritual. First, Tommy pulled out his crayons. 24 colors, always arranged in the same order. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple, then all the other colors in between. He lined them up perfectly along the edge of the table, adjusting each one until they were exactly where they needed to be. If someone accidentally moved one, even by an inch, Tommy would have to start all over again. Next came the drawing pad. Tommy opened it to a fresh page and began drawing what he always drew first. A circle for the sun with 8 lines coming out of it. Always 8, never more, never less. Then a rectangle for the diner, and a smaller rectangle for their table. It was his way of making sense of the world, David had learned. Everything had to be organized, predictable, safe. "Good morning, folks." The waitress approached their table with a tired smile. David recognized her. Linda, maybe? Or was it Lisa? She'd been working here for about 6 months, and she was nice enough. But she always seemed a little nervous around Tommy. "Morning," David replied. "We'll have the usual." She nodded and jotted something down on her pad, not bothering to ask what the usual was. After coming here every Saturday for 2 years, most of the staff knew. 2 stacks of pancakes, no butter, with the syrup served in separate containers so Tommy could control exactly how much went on each bite. Orange juice for Tommy, black coffee for David. The eggs had to be scrambled very soft, and the bacon crispy but not burnt. It sounded simple, but David had learned that nothing was simple when you had a child like Tommy. Every detail mattered. Too much syrup and Tommy wouldn't eat. Bacon that was too chewy and he'd push the whole plate away. Changes in routine could turn their peaceful morning into a meltdown that would leave both of them exhausted. As the waitress walked away, David watched his son continue drawing. Tommy was incredibly talented for a 6-year-old. His pictures were detailed and precise, showing things that most kids his age would never notice. But he'd never said a single word about them, never pointed to show David what he'd drawn, never smiled with pride when he finished a particularly good picture. 3 years ago, before everything changed, Tommy had been different. He'd babbled like most babies do, said mama and dada, even tried to sing along to his favorite songs. But after his mother died in that car accident, something in Tommy had just stopped. The doctor said it wasn't unusual for children with autism to regress after trauma, but David couldn't help wondering if it was his fault somehow. If he'd been a better father, a more attentive husband, maybe none of this would have happened. The food arrived and Tommy immediately inspected everything on his plate. David held his breath. Sometimes Tommy would eat everything without any problems. Other times, if something was slightly different, he'd refuse to touch any of it. Today seemed like a good day. Tommy picked up his fork and began eating his pancakes, one small, careful bite at a time. David tried to enjoy his own breakfast, but he found himself watching the other families in the diner instead. At the table near the window, a father was teaching his daughter how to read the menu. She was probably around Tommy's age, asking questions in that excited, chatty way that 6-year-olds do. "Daddy, what's this word?" she asked, pointing at something on the menu. "That says blueberry," her father replied. "Do you want blueberry pancakes?" "Yes, can I have extra blueberries?" "Please, please, please." Her father laughed. "Of course you can." David felt that familiar ache in his chest. He'd give anything to have that kind of conversation with Tommy. To hear his son's voice asking for extra blueberries, or telling him about a dream he'd had, or just saying, "I love you," add one more time. But that wasn't the hand they'd been dealt. David had learned to find joy in smaller things. The way Tommy's face lit up when the cook flipped a pancake especially high. The gentle humming sounds he made when he was content. The way he always saved the last bite of his pancakes for David to try, even though David had his own plate. It wasn't the relationship he'd imagined having with his son, but it was theirs. And David wouldn't trade Tommy for anything in the world. As they finished eating, Tommy began putting his crayons back in his backpack, each one in its proper place. Soon it would be time to go home and their week would continue with its own routines and patterns. Physical therapy on Monday, occupational therapy on Tuesday, speech therapy on Wednesday, even though Tommy hadn't spoken in years. David paid the bill and left a generous tip, like he always did. As they walked toward the door, he noticed the businessman from the corner booth was still staring. This time David didn't look away. He met the man's eyes and gave him a small nod as if to say, "Yes, this is my son. He's different, but he's wonderful." Outside in the parking lot, Tommy stopped walking and looked back at the diner. For just a moment, David thought he might say something. But instead, Tommy just smiled. It was a small smile, barely noticeable to anyone else, but David saw it. And for now, that was enough. The next Saturday morning started like any other. David and Tommy arrived at Rosie's diner at 9:15 a.m. sharp, parking in their usual spot. Tommy carried his red backpack and walked with that familiar bounce in his step as they approached the familiar door. The bell chimed above them, and David prepared himself for the usual routine. But something was different today. Instead of Linda or one of the other regular waitresses, a young woman David had never seen before was wiping down tables near their booth. She had dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail and wore the standard Rosie's Diner uniform. But there was something about the way she moved that caught David's attention. She wasn't rushing around like most of the other servers. Instead, she seemed to be paying careful attention to each table, each customer, as if she was studying them. Tommy headed straight for their corner booth, just like always. He slid into his usual seat and began unpacking his crayons. David watched as the new waitress noticed Tommy's ritual from across the room. Most people either stared rudely or looked away uncomfortably when they saw Tommy arranging his crayons in their precise order. But this woman just observed quietly, almost professionally. "Good morning," she said as she approached their table. Her voice was warm but not overly cheerful in that fake way some people used around Tommy. "I'm Rosa. I'll be taking care of you today." David looked up, ready to give their usual order, but Rosa wasn't looking at him. She was watching Tommy with genuine interest as he lined up his 24 crayons along the edge of the table. There was no judgment in her eyes, no confusion or pity. Just understanding. "We'll have our usual," David said, then realized she was new and wouldn't know what that meant. 2 stacks of pancakes, no butter, syrup on the side. Orange juice and black coffee. Scrambled eggs, very soft, and crispy bacon. Rosa nodded and wrote everything down, but David noticed she was still glancing at Tommy. His son had moved on to drawing his morning picture. The sun with 8 rays, the rectangle representing the diner, the smaller rectangle for their table. The same picture he drew every Saturday. "He's very precise with his colors," Rosa observed quietly. David felt his shoulders tense, ready to defend Tommy if necessary. People often made comments about his son's behaviors, and they weren't always kind. But Rosa's tone was different. She sounded impressed. "Yes, he is." David replied carefully. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple, then the others in between, Rosa continued, and David realized she'd been watching closely enough to notice the exact pattern. That's a beautiful way to organize them. Very logical. Tommy looked up from his drawing for just a moment, making brief eye contact with Rosa before returning to his work. It was more interaction than he usually had with strangers. Rosa headed to the kitchen to place their order, and David found himself watching her. She moved differently than the other waitresses. When she passed tables with families, he noticed how she seemed to pick up on small details. She brought extra napkins to a table with toddlers without being asked. She noticed when an elderly man's coffee cup was empty before he had to signal for a refill. When she returned with their drinks, Rosa did something unexpected. Instead of just setting them down and walking away, she pulled out her order pad and set it on the table next to Tommy's drawing. "That's a really good picture of our diner," she said to Tommy, though she didn't expect an answer. "You got all the details right. Even the windows." Tommy glanced at her notepad, then at his own drawing. Rosa seemed to notice his interest. "You know what?" she said, tearing off a clean sheet from her pad. "I have some extra paper if you want to draw something else." She placed the small piece of paper next to Tommy's drawing pad and continued with her other tables. David was surprised. Most people either ignored Tommy completely or tried too hard to get his attention. Rosa had found some kind of middle ground, offering him something without making it feel like pressure. Tommy looked at the piece of paper for a long moment. Then, to David's amazement, he picked up his red crayon and began drawing on it. Their food arrived a few minutes later, and David expected Rosa to just drop off the plates and move on. Instead, she noticed what Tommy had drawn on the small piece of paper. It was a picture of pancakes, but not just any pancakes. Tommy had drawn them with incredible detail, showing exactly how he liked them arranged on the plate, with small circles representing the specific pattern he preferred for his syrup. "Oh, wow," Rosa said softly, looking at the drawing. "These pancakes look delicious. Is this how you like them?" Tommy didn't answer verbally, but he looked up at Rosa and then at his actual plate of pancakes. David watched in fascination as his son began rearranging the pancakes on his plate to match his drawing exactly. "He's showing you," David explained, his voice filled with wonder. "He's never done that before." "With anyone," Rosa smiled. "He's a very smart boy. This drawing tells me exactly what he wants." As they ate, David found himself studying Rosa more carefully. She seemed to understand something about Tommy that others missed. When she checked on their table, she didn't interrupt Tommy's eating routine. She noticed that he always saved his last bite of pancake for David to try, and she commented on how nice that was without making a big deal about it. "Can I ask you something?" David said when Rosa came by with the coffee pot. "Of course. You seem to get him, Tommy, I mean. Most people don't." Rosa was quiet for a moment, refilling David's cup. "I worked with kids like Tommy before," she said finally. "Every child has their own way of communicating. You just have to learn their language." "What kind of work?" "I was a special education teacher," Rosa replied. "I had to take a break from that, but I learned that every child is trying to tell us something. We just have to pay attention to how they're saying it." David felt something shift inside his chest. For 3 years, he'd been surrounded by doctors and therapists who spoke about Tommy in clinical terms, professionals who saw his son as a collection of symptoms to be managed. But Rosa was talking about Tommy like he was just a kid with his own unique way of seeing the world. As they finished eating, Tommy did something that made David's heart skip. He took Rosa's piece of paper and drew something new. This time it wasn't just pancakes. It was a picture of Rosa herself standing next to their table. The drawing was simple but unmistakably her, complete with her ponytail and her name tag. When Rosa saw the drawing, her eyes lit up. "Is that me?" she asked Tommy gently. Tommy looked up at her, and for the first time in months, David saw something in his son's eyes that he'd almost forgotten existed. Interest, connection, the beginning of trust. "That's beautiful, Tommy," Rosa said. "Thank you for drawing me. Can I keep this?" Tommy nodded just slightly, but it was enough. David felt tears forming in his eyes as he watched this simple exchange. His son, who hadn't shown interest in connecting with anyone new in years, had just given this stranger a gift. As they prepared to leave, David left an extra large tip. But more than that, he left with something he hadn't felt in a very long time: Hope. Maybe there were still people in the world who could see Tommy for who he really was, rather than what he couldn't do. Walking to the car, David noticed Tommy looking back at the diner just like he always did. But this time, David thought he saw something different in that backward glance. Maybe, just maybe, his son was looking forward to coming back next Saturday. 3 weeks had passed since that first morning with Rosa, and David found himself looking forward to Saturdays in a way he hadn't in years. Not just because of his time with Tommy, but because of what happened when they walked through those diner doors. Tommy was changing. It started small. The second Saturday when Rosa approached their table, Tommy looked up immediately instead of staying focused on his crayons. The third week he had his drawing ready before she even asked about it. But this fourth Saturday was different from the moment they walked in. Tommy practically pulled David toward their usual booth, his eyes scanning the diner until he spotted Rosa wiping down a table near the kitchen. When he saw her, something incredible happened. Tommy smiled. Not the tiny, barely there smile David occasionally glimpsed at home, but a real, genuine smile that lit up his entire face. "Well, good morning, Tommy," Rosa said as she approached their table, and David noticed she greeted his son first, not him. "Did you bring me any new drawings today?" Tommy was already reaching into his backpack, pulling out not just his usual drawing supplies, but a whole folder of pictures. David's eyes widened. He had no idea Tommy had been drawing extra pictures at home. Rosa sat down in the booth next to David, something that surprised him. In 3 years of coming here, no server had ever actually sat with them, but Rosa acted like it was the most natural thing in the world. "May I see?" she asked Tommy gently. Tommy opened his folder and began laying out picture after picture on the table. There were drawings of the diner from different angles, pictures of the cook flipping pancakes, and several drawings of Rosa herself. But what made David's breath catch were the other pictures. Tommy had drawn their house, his bedroom, even David sitting at his computer working. "Tommy, these are amazing," Rosa said, and David could hear the genuine amazement in her voice. "You see so many details that other people miss." She picked up one of the drawings of the diner. "Look, you even drew the little crack in the window over there, and the way the light comes in through the blinds. You're like a photographer, but with crayons." Tommy was watching Rosa's face as she looked at each drawing, and David realized his son was studying her reactions. When Rosa smiled at a particular drawing, Tommy would point to it and then point to her as if asking if she really liked it. "You know what, Tommy?" Rosa said, reaching into her apron pocket. "I made something for you too." She pulled out a small handmade book. The cover was decorated with colorful drawings, and when she opened it, David saw pages filled with simple pictures and words. "I thought maybe we could try something new," Rosa explained. "These are pictures of different foods you might like. See this one? It's pancakes. And this one is orange juice." She pointed to each picture as she spoke, and David noticed that under each drawing was the word written in clear, simple letters. But what made this special was that Rosa had drawn the pictures herself. In a style very similar to Tommy's own artwork, Tommy picked up the book carefully, turning each page with the same precision he used when arranging his crayons. When he got to a page with a drawing of bacon, he looked up at Rosa and pointed to it. "You want bacon this morning?" Rosa asked. Tommy nodded. It was small, but it was the clearest response David had seen his son give to anyone in months. "Crispy or soft?" Rosa asked, showing Tommy 2 different pictures of bacon. Tommy pointed to the crispy bacon, then looked at David as if to say, "See? I can tell her what I want." Over the next hour, as they ate their breakfast, Rosa introduced Tommy to more pages in the book. There were pictures for more, all done, thank you, and please. But she didn't push him to use them. She just showed him that they were there if he wanted them. About halfway through their meal, Tommy picked up the book and pointed to a picture of a smiling face, then pointed to Rosa. It took David a moment to understand, but Rosa got it immediately. "You're happy?" she asked. "I'm happy too, Tommy." Then Tommy did something that made David's heart race. He pointed to... "That's right," Rosa said softly. "We're all happy to be here together." David felt tears starting to form in his eyes. His son was communicating complex ideas, sharing feelings, connecting with another person in ways David hadn't seen since before his wife's death. As they finished eating, Rosa pulled out another surprise. She had brought a small photo album, the kind with plastic sleeves for pictures. "I was thinking," she said to Tommy, Maybe you'd like to keep some of your drawings in here. That way you can bring your favorites to show me each week. Tommy examined the photo album carefully, running his fingers over the smooth cover. Then he selected 3 of his drawings, the ones Rosa had complimented the most, and carefully slid them into the plastic sleeves. But then something magical happened. Rosa had left her order pad on the table and Tommy picked it up. He started drawing on it, but this wasn't like his usual detailed pictures. This was different. He drew simple shapes, quick sketches, almost like he was trying to have a conversation through pictures. He drew a circle with a smile, then pointed to Rosa. Happy Rosa. Then he drew another circle with a bigger smile and pointed to himself. Very happy, Tommy. You're very happy? Rosa asked. Tommy nodded vigorously, more animated than David had seen him in years. Then Tommy drew something that made both adults freeze. He drew 3 circles together with smiles on all of them. A family of circles. He pointed to Rosa, then to David, then to himself. Rosa looked at David and they shared a moment of understanding. Tommy was telling them that he saw them as his family. All 3 of them together. Tommy, Rosa said gently, would you like to learn some words to go with your pictures? Tommy looked at her with intense focus, the way he did when something really interested him. Rosa pointed to the happy face in her book. This is happy, she said clearly. Happy. Tommy's lips moved slightly as if he was trying to form the word silently. Rosa tried another word, pointing to the pancakes. Pancakes, she said slowly. Again, Tommy's mouth moved and David found himself holding his breath. Then Rosa did something brilliant. She pointed to herself and said very clearly, Rosa. Tommy looked at her intently. His mouth opened slightly and David could see him trying to form the sounds. Ro, he whispered so quietly that David almost missed it. That's right. Rosa encouraged gently. Rosa, Rosa. Tommy tried again, a little louder this time. Rosa. The word was soft, slightly unclear, but it was definitely a word, a name. The first word Tommy had spoken in almost 3 years. David felt like the world had stopped spinning. His son had just spoken. Not to a therapist, not in a clinical setting, but here in their favorite diner. To a waitress who had shown him more understanding in a month than some people had in years. Did you hear that? David whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. Rosa was smiling so wide it looked like her face might split in half. I heard it, Tommy. You said my name. That was perfect. Tommy, sensing the excitement and joy around him, started to giggle. It was a sound David hadn't heard since Tommy was 3 years old. Pure, delighted laughter. Rosa, Tommy said again, clearer this time, and then he laughed again. David had to excuse himself to the bathroom because he couldn't stop the tears from coming. His son was talking. After all the expensive therapists, all the specialists, all the failed attempts, it had taken one kind waitress with a homemade picture book to unlock something in Tommy that David had feared was gone forever. When he returned to the table, Rosa was showing Tommy more pictures and Tommy was trying to say some of the words. Pancake. Juice. More. As they prepared to leave, Tommy carefully packed his new photo album in his backpack, right next to his crayons. But before they headed to the door, he did something that nearly broke David's heart with joy. Tommy walked over to Rosa, looked right up at her, and said as clearly as he could manage, "Thank you, Rosa." Then he hugged her. David stood there watching his nonverbal son speak and show affection to someone who had entered their lives just a month ago, and he knew that everything was about to change. David couldn't stop thinking about Rosa. It had been 2 weeks since Tommy spoke his first words, and every day his son was getting better at communicating. At home, Tommy would practice saying Rosa over and over, and he'd started trying other words too. Daddy, pancakes, more, please. Simple words, but each one felt like a miracle. But it wasn't just Tommy's progress that kept Rosa on David's mind. It was the way she had appeared in their lives at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right skills, like some kind of guardian angel. David had learned to be suspicious of coincidences. In his business world, when something seemed too good to be true, it usually was, so he started paying attention. During their Saturday visits, David began noticing small details about Rosa that he'd missed before. Her shoes were worn down at the heels, the kind of wear that came from being on your feet for long hours. Her uniform was always clean and pressed, but he could see where it had been mended in a few places. She never ordered food during her shifts, only coffee, and she always looked tired, like someone who worked more than one job. One Saturday morning, David decided to arrive early. He parked across the street from the diner at 8:30 a.m. and watched. Rosa was already there, setting up tables and preparing for the breakfast rush. Through the window, he could see her moving quickly, efficiently, doing the work of someone who couldn't afford to waste time. At 9:15, when they normally arrived, David and Tommy walked in to find Rosa had already prepared something special for Tommy. She'd made new pages for his picture book, including drawings of different weather conditions and emotions. But David noticed something that made his chest tighten. The pictures were drawn on the back of what looked like old homework papers, and the binding was held together with Scotch tape. "Rosa, this must have taken you hours," David said as Tommy excitedly looked through the new pages. Rosa shrugged. "I enjoy making them. Tommy gives me good ideas." That afternoon, David found himself doing something he rarely did anymore. He left work early. Instead of going home, he drove back to the diner. Rosa's shift should have ended at 3 p.m., but when he arrived at 4:30, she was still there, now wearing different clothes and cleaning tables. David waited in his car until 6 p.m., when Rosa finally left the diner. But instead of going home, she walked 3 blocks to a small grocery store. David followed at a distance, feeling slightly guilty for what felt like spying, but unable to stop himself. Inside the store, he watched Rosa carefully comparing prices on generic brands, using coupons and buying only the basics: bread, milk, generic soup, the cheapest pasta. When she got to the pharmacy section, she spent a long time looking at medications, checking prices, and making calculations on a small piece of paper. David stayed hidden behind a display of cereal boxes, but he could see Rosa's face as she looked at the prices. She looked worried, stressed, like someone trying to make impossible math work. The next Monday, David did something he'd never done before. He used his business connections to quietly look into Rosa's background. What he found broke his heart. Rosa Martinez was 28 years old and had been a special education teacher at Lincoln Elementary School for 4 years. According to public records, she'd received several teaching awards and had glowing reviews from parents and administrators. But she'd resigned from her position 8 months ago. David dug deeper legally and carefully. He learned that Rosa lived with her 73-year-old grandmother, Elena Martinez, who had been diagnosed with diabetes and early-stage dementia. Elena needed constant care and expensive medications that weren't fully covered by her basic insurance. Rosa had quit her teaching job to become her grandmother's full-time caregiver. She worked at the diner 6 days a week, often pulling double shifts. On her days off, she took online courses to maintain her teaching certification, hoping to return to education someday when her grandmother's condition stabilized. But David found something else that made him realize just how special Rosa truly was. He discovered that Rosa had been volunteering at a local community center, teaching basic communication skills to children with special needs. Even working 60 hours a week and caring for her grandmother, she still found time to help other families, dealing with challenges similar to what Tommy faced. David also learned that Rosa had been buying art supplies with her own money to create communication tools not just for Tommy, but for other children she worked with at the community center. The picture books, the drawing materials, everything came out of her own pocket, despite her obvious financial struggles. On Thursday, David made a decision. He drove to Rosa's neighborhood, a modest area with small, older homes. He found her address and parked across the street, not to spy this time, but to understand the full picture of her life. The house was tiny but well-maintained. The small front yard was filled with carefully tended flowers and vegetables. David could see Rosa through the front window, sitting at a kitchen table with an elderly woman who must be her grandmother. Rosa was helping her grandmother with what looked like physical therapy exercises, speaking to her in Spanish with infinite patience. Later that evening, as David was putting Tommy to bed, his son surprised him. "Daddy," Tommy said, his speech still slow but getting clearer every day. "Rosa. Sad?" David looked at his son in amazement. "What makes you think Rosa is sad, buddy?" Tommy pointed to his own eyes. "Rosa, eyes sad like Mommy." David's heart clenched. Tommy was remembering his mother's sadness during her last months when she was sick and tired all the time. And somehow his son had picked up on Rosa's hidden exhaustion and worry. Rosa works very hard, David explained gently. She takes care of her grandma like how I take care of you. Tommy nodded seriously. Then he said something that nearly brought David to his knees. Help Rosa? Do you want to help Rosa? David asked. Yes, Tommy said firmly. Rosa helped Tommy. Tommy helped Rosa. That Friday, David did more research, this time into Elena Martinez's medical needs. He learned that she required specialized diabetes care, memory care services, and medications that cost nearly $2,000 a month. Rosa's salary from the diner barely covered rent and basic groceries, leaving almost nothing for her grandmother's medical expenses. David also discovered that Rosa had applied for several grants and assistance programs, but most had waiting lists or requirements that she didn't quite meet. She was caught in that terrible middle ground where she made too much money to qualify for full assistance, but not nearly enough to actually cover their needs. On Saturday morning, David and Tommy arrived at the diner as usual. But David saw Rosa with completely new eyes. He noticed how she discreetly rubbed her feet when she thought no one was looking, how she sometimes paused between tables and took deep breaths, as if she was summoning energy she didn't really have. But he also saw how her face lit up when Tommy ran to her with a drawing he'd made at home. How she sat with him for extra minutes even when other tables needed attention. How she celebrated each new word he spoke as if it were the most important thing in the world. Rosa, Tommy said clearly as they finished breakfast. Thank you for helping Tommy talk. Rosa's eyes filled with tears. Thank you for being such a good friend, Tommy. As David watched this exchange, he realized something profound. Rosa wasn't just helping Tommy find his voice. She was doing it while sacrificing her own dreams, her own future, her own financial security. She was giving everything she had to help others, including his son, even when she could barely take care of herself and her grandmother. That's when David knew what he had to do. Rosa had given Tommy something priceless. She'd given him back his ability to communicate, to connect, to be understood. She'd done it with patience, creativity, and love, asking for nothing in return except the joy of seeing Tommy succeed. Now it was David's turn to give Rosa something priceless. Not just money, though she clearly needed that, but something bigger. The chance to use her incredible gift for helping children like Tommy, without having to choose between her calling and her family's survival. As they left the diner that morning, David's mind was already working on a plan that would change Rosa's life forever. Tommy deserved to keep working with someone who understood him so completely, and Rosa deserved to have her kindness and sacrifice rewarded in ways she never could have imagined. The question wasn't whether to help Rosa. The question was how to do it in a way that would allow her to keep her dignity while giving her everything she needed to keep changing lives, starting with Tommy's. David spent the entire week planning exactly what he was going to say to Rosa. He'd handled million-dollar business deals, negotiated contracts with major corporations, and given presentations to rooms full of investors. But somehow this conversation felt more important and more nerve-wracking than all of those combined. By Friday night, he'd written down his thoughts on paper, crossed them out, and started over at least 10 times. Tommy found him at the kitchen table surrounded by crumpled papers. "Daddy okay?" Tommy asked, his speech still slow but much clearer than it had been just a month ago. "Daddy's just thinking about how to help Rosa," David explained. Tommy climbed onto the chair next to his father. "Rosa said," he said with certainty. "Tommy, help Rosa be happy." "That's exactly what Daddy wants to do too, buddy." Tommy picked up one of David's crumpled papers and smoothed it out. He couldn't read the words, but he could see his father's stress in the messy handwriting. "Talk to Rosa," Tommy said simply. "Rosa nice. Rosa listen." Out of the mouths of babes, David thought. His 6-year-old son was right. Rosa was kind and understanding. She would listen. David was overthinking this. Saturday morning arrived with the usual routine, but David's heart was pounding as they walked into the diner. Rosa greeted them with her warm smile, and Tommy immediately showed her a new drawing he'd made during the week. It was a picture of the three of them standing together outside the diner, all smiling. "This is beautiful, Tommy," Rosa said, examining the drawing carefully. "We look like a very happy family." David took a deep breath. This was his opening. Rosa, can I talk to you about something important? He asked after Tommy had finished his breakfast and started working on a new drawing. Rosa looked slightly concerned. Of course. Is everything okay? Everything's more than okay, David said. Tommy has made more progress in the past month than he had in the previous 2 years. And that's entirely because of you. Rosa started to shake her head, but David continued. Please, just hear me out. I know you were a special education teacher before you started working here. Rosa's face went pale. How did you— I'm sorry, David said quickly. I didn't mean to invade your privacy. But when I see someone changing my son's life the way you have, I want to understand who they are. Rosa was quiet, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. I know you're taking care of your grandmother. David continued gently. I know you left teaching to be with her, and I know you're working here to try to cover her medical expenses. Tears started forming in Rosa's eyes. Mr. Thompson, I don't know what you're trying to say, but I'm trying to say that you shouldn't have to choose between taking care of your family and using your gift to help children like Tommy. David interrupted. What if there was a way for you to do both? Rosa wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I don't understand. David pulled out a folder he'd brought with him. I've been thinking about this all week. Tommy needs someone like you, not just now but long term. Someone who understands how his mind works, who can help him continue developing his communication skills. He opened the folder and showed Rosa the papers inside. I want to hire you as Tommy's personal educational specialist, full-time. The salary would be $85,000 a year, plus full health benefits for you and your grandmother. Rosa stared at the papers, then looked up at David in shock. I can't. That's too much money. You don't even know if I'm qualified. Rosa, you've accomplished more with Tommy in 4 weeks than teams of specialists did in 2 years, David said. You're not just qualified. You're exactly what he needs. Rosa was shaking her head. But your business, your work. You can't just hire someone to follow you around. David smiled. I'm not asking you to follow me around. I'm asking you to let me set up a proper learning environment for Tommy, with all the tools and resources you need. We could convert the spare room in my house into a classroom, or rent a separate space if you'd prefer. Whatever works best for Tommy's learning. But my grandmother— The position comes with flexible hours, David explained. You could work around her needs, and the health insurance would cover her medications and doctor visits. Rosa was crying now, real tears streaming down her face. I don't know what to say. This is too generous. Too much. Tommy looked up from his drawing, sensing the emotion at the table. Rosa crying? He asked with concern. Rosa's okay, buddy, David assured him. Sometimes people cry when they're happy. Tommy studied Rosa's face carefully, then got up from his side of the booth and climbed in next to her. Rosa happy cry? He asked. Rosa wrapped her arms around Tommy and hugged him tight. Yes, Tommy, happy cry. But there's more, David said softly. This isn't just about Tommy. I've been researching what you were doing at the community center, how you've been helping other families. What if we could do that on a bigger scale? Rosa looked at him questioningly. I want to start a foundation, David explained. A non-profit organization that trains people to work with nonverbal children and their families. You could develop the training programs, create materials like the picture books you made for Tommy, and teach other people your methods. Rosa was speechless. Think about it, David continued. How many other children are out there like Tommy? How many other families are struggling to communicate with their kids? You could help hundreds, maybe thousands of families. I need time to think about this, Rosa whispered. Of course, David said. Take all the time you need. But Rosa, I want you to know that this isn't charity. This is investment. You're investing in Tommy's future and I'm investing in yours. This is what people do when they care about each other. Tommy, who had been listening to the conversation without fully understanding it, suddenly spoke up. Rosa, stay with Tommy? Rosa looked down at the little boy still hugged against her side. Would you like me to stay with you, Tommy? Yes, Tommy said firmly. Rosa, teach Tommy. Tommy, teach other kids too. David felt his heart swell with pride. Even at 6 years old, Tommy understood that learning was something to be shared. Rosa was quiet for a long moment, looking back and forth between David and Tommy. Finally, she spoke. Can I bring my grandmother to meet you both before I give you an answer? Of course, David said immediately. I'd love to meet her. 2 days later, Rosa brought her grandmother Elena to David's house. Elena was a tiny, elegant woman with Rosa's same kind eyes. Despite her memory issues, she was sharp enough to understand what David was offering her granddaughter. "Mijo," Elena said to David in her heavily accented English. "My Rosa has a gift. She sees things in children that other people miss. If you give her the chance to use this gift, she will change the world." "I believe that," David replied. "That's exactly what I'm hoping for." Elena turned to Tommy, who was showing her his collection of drawings. "And you, Pequeño, you are very lucky to have found our Rosa." Tommy nodded seriously. Rosa helped Tommy talk. "How Tommy helped Rosa help other kids?" Elena smiled and patted Tommy's cheek. "Yes, mijo. That's exactly right." That afternoon, Rosa accepted David's offer. 6 months later, the Tommy and Rosa Communications Center opened its doors in a bright, colorful building downtown. Rosa had developed a complete training program for working with nonverbal children, and families came from hundreds of miles away to learn her methods. Tommy was thriving, speaking in full sentences and even helping Rosa demonstrate techniques to other children. He had become the center's unofficial mascot, proof of what was possible with patience, understanding, and the right approach. David found himself more fulfilled than he'd ever been in his business career. Watching Rosa teach, seeing Tommy help other children find their voices, knowing that their chance meeting at a small diner had created something that would help families for generations to come. Every Saturday morning, the three of them still went to Rosie's diner, not because they had to anymore, but because they wanted to remember where it all started, where a millionaire single dad saw a waitress teaching his nonverbal son to speak and decided that some connections are worth everything. Rosa always brought her picture books, and Tommy always drew new pictures to share. But now they also brought other children from the center, other families who were just beginning their own journeys toward communication and understanding. The corner booth at Rosie's had become a symbol of hope, proof that sometimes the most important moments in life happen in the most ordinary places, between the most unexpected people. And Tommy, now speaking clearly and confidently, always ended their Saturday visits the same way. "Thank you, Rosa, for teaching me that everyone has something important to say. We just have to find the right way to say it."